it's very nice to meet you today. I'm told that you're very talkative, so I will exploit that to make you do at least 2/3 of the work. So, my topic is differentiated integration and democracy. All political scientists have to spend at least half of the time working on definitions, and we've got at least 3 definitions in here: integration, differentiated integration, and democracy. So let me start with the last of those. Who's going to define democracy for me? Let's have some suggestions. Just off the top of your head, just your intuitions about what you think democracy is.
Okay, well, usually also when we think to referendum, as the most important form of direct democracy, we mean the democracy require citizens to directly decide upon.
Okay. So citizens decide. Ultimately, citizens decide. I mean, it may be at the very end of a long road, but ultimately, ultimately, citizens decide. Yes, please.
We can define democracy as a political system in which basically the main source of legitimacy is, let's say,
Right. So the public is the main source of legitimacy. Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, in pursuit of that, I would say transparency.
Transparency. I mean, obviously, we can either go for some kind of core definition of the basic minimum criteria and principles, or we can look at kind of extensions and conditions and ways of realizing it. Anyone else before I offer you a suggestion? Yes, please. Sovereignty is in the hands of the people. Again, this idea that the people has the ultimate control and government must ultimately be legitimated and justified by the rule of the people in some kind of a way. Anyway, that's fantastic for just getting us to a start. Here's mine. It's the first one. You will ask me, why ever this? Why ever this? Public control with political quality and a right to a justification. Now, I think these are the minimum standards. This is the very basic minimum you need. You can tell me it's ruled by the people. You can tell me it's legitimation by the people. But I think these are the absolute minimum conditions you need for that. Public control with political equality and a right to a justification. Why public control? Well, the public doesn't need to rule. We have representative democracies. The public does not need to make the decisions itself. It may have to make the ultimate decision, but it doesn't need to make all of the decisions. But we wouldn't describe a system as democratic if the public could not control it, right? So we can have rule by representatives, but that's only a democracy if the public can control the representatives. Usually, that means periodic opportunities to throw the bastards out. Elections, okay? So public control. Why political equality? Let's imagine a system in which some people have more than one vote. We used to have this before 1949 in the United Kingdom. There were university constituencies. Graduates of particular universities could vote twice. And in Prussia before 1914, some people had 3 votes, some people 2 votes, some people had 1 vote. What's the problem with that? What's the problem with some people having more votes than others? Yes? No political equality. Why is that a problem? The same right, the same rights. Imbalance of interests. If some people have more votes than others, then you have an element of rule of the rest of the people by some of the people. So it really has to be one person, one vote. If there's some groups in society who have more votes than others, if there's some individuals who've got more votes than others, then there is an element of rule of the rest of the people by some of the people. So I think we've got to have political equality in there. Finally, Why a right to a justification? That sounds very odd and obscure, but I think it's crucially important. Yeah.
I mean, because without justification, the government doesn't have stability, doesn't have the power to, let's say, to impose the decision of the people need to accept.
So democracy, like any other system of rule, is actually a system of coercion. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it needs to be accepted.
You have to obey the law, even if it's made democratically. You have to obey the law. So even democracy is a system of coercion. So we need to be able to justify why majorities should have the right to impose decisions on others, to coerce others into following democratically decided decisions. So I think we've got to have these three ingredients. And what it turns out, this is how it kind of pans out. Citizens must be able, as equals, to control the making, administration, and amendment of their own laws. Okay? So thousands and thousands of laws, all of them must ultimately be within the control of citizens. Citizens should ultimately be able to control the making, the amendment, the administration of their own laws. I think that's the basic requirement. Okay, we will move down from these high levels of abstraction and start talking about specifics. What are the conditions? I've listed a series here. Maybe some people will say there are a few more that I've forgotten, but let's just run through them very quickly. I mean, I think they're fairly obvious, but I do want to run through them quickly because it's going to be important to our discussion of differentiation in a bit. Rights. Pretty obvious rights are needed if citizens are going to be able to control their own laws as equals. They're going to need rights of free speech. They're going to need rights of association. A public sphere. A public debate. How can you have justification without a public sphere, without public debate? How can you justify the decisions of the majority to the minority without a public sphere and a public debate? How can you have public opinion formation? The public must be able to get together to form opinions on what it wants its governments to do and also to kind of assess, evaluate the performance of governments. Civil society. If there's no civil society, governments can dominate. Again, this is part of the process of organizing public opinion as well. Rule of law. There needs to be agreement on how majorities are formed. There are lots and lots of different ways of having public control with political equality and rights to a justification. You need a basic agreement on the procedures that need to be followed in trying to kind of compete politically to form majorities. So you need prior agreement on the basic rules, the rule of law. It's not enough. It's not enough just to have elections. Knowledge, public knowledge. Now, this is an interesting one. I think we might kind of pause on this one. I'll ask you, how much knowledge do you think is needed? How much knowledge? Do we need citizens who are perfectly rational? Let's put the question that way. Do we need citizens who are perfectly rational? Citizens who understand and know everything? Of course we don't. So if we don't need that, how much knowledge, broadly, how much knowledge do you think citizens need? Could a democracy work with citizens who've only got a tiny, tiny bit of knowledge, so long as it's the right kind of knowledge? What do you think?
Well, we made yesterday's example about Brexit, so how the government of Boris Johnson maybe did not tell everything.
Right.
Then they maybe took the wrong choice.
So there could be a problem of deception.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't even raised that, but there could be a problem of deception.
I guess it will come to the citizens themselves of how much they want to actually engage in democracy. In some countries, they can choose to portray something in the media that is the only means of information. Just, they will judge the trends and
Okay. Yes, please.
Yes, well, I feel like in an ideal society, citizens would be educated on what they're voting for.
Mm-hmm.
And I live between Switzerland and France. And
Yeah.
when we have elections in France, we're pretty much left to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But then in Switzerland, they vote on a very specific topic.
Right.
Sometimes, yeah,
Right.
referendums and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And my friends who are citizens of there get like information packets
Mm-hmm.
in the mail
Mm-hmm.
that very explicitly say what is going on, what
Mm-hmm.
is going for. And I feel like that's something that should be more implemented, but I mean, where I live, we don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they don't actually read. That's the problem. That sometimes they don't read. Like at least they have the information, but they don't really get to read it.
Mm-hmm.
Like participation rates are super low.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's complicated.
It is indeed complicated. But would somebody try to argue that we can get by with citizens just having a little bit of knowledge, so long as it's the right kind of knowledge? Would anyone like to try that one?
Basically need to know what the position they're voting for is.
Yeah, okay.
And
Mm-hmm.
who the people they're voting for are,
Right.
ideally, or some indicator of what the person filling that position represents. So like if you don't know
Okay.
the person specifically, but you know the political parties,
Mm-hmm.
say, and you
Yeah.
know that political
Yeah.
party will usually align or disalign with your views.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
can sometimes be sufficient
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
someone to make a choice.
I think that's right. I think that's pretty well the argument I was trying to get at. That maybe if citizens know what the basic dimensions of politics are, if citizens know what the basic choices, the basic cleavages, the basic conflicts are, kind of left-right, then you can make a pretty informed decision about what kind of government you want by just saying, oh, well, this one's a bit to the left of that one, the other one's a bit to the right of this or of that. So it may be that democracies can get by relatively slender knowledge, so long as it's the right kind. I mean, another one is government and opposition, right? So if citizens know which parties are in government and which parties are in opposition, they at least know who to blame, the bastards who should be kicked out in periodic elections and those who might replace them. Now, is everyone happy with that answer? That maybe we can get by with only some basic distinctions, basic forms of knowledge? Can anyone see problems with that?
Yeah, I mean, even if citizens were willing to say their ideology, like they only want to vote for that party. I'm going to give the example of Israel, for instance. A lot of citizens may vote for parties that may not even pass the parliament,
Yeah.
and then those vote in no ways, and then, for instance, if they voted left, and those parties not pass, then say right-wing parties may get like more percentage of votes.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like an effect. So
Yeah.
I think it system also needs to be a bit more strategic.
Mm-hmm. Well, strategic behavior is an interesting question. Yes, please.
I think there's also a problem with manipulation because they
Manipulation, okay.
willingness to make
Right. So we've had deception, manipulation is another problem, people behaving strategically.
Arguably, those also apply though when people do have more knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. So that can happen at almost any level of knowledge that is possible. Okay.
I think that there are problems with having a minimum level of knowledge, but then there's also the argument of practicality. Like
Yeah.
you're not going to get millions of people to all have the same level of
Yeah,
knowledge
yeah.
of an election. That's
And why is that going to be a problem?
well, because people are going to be making their decisions based off of different things, and people
Okay.
are maybe not all going to have the information on what.
And it's also political equality, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we're back with that one. Mm-hmm.
The problem is that if you want to have all people have the same knowledge, then you have uniformity. You don't have different.
Right. I think that's probably what I was driving at. These ideas that you can kind of get by with very little knowledge probably presuppose a pretty simple society and political system. It's one-dimensional. It's left, right. There's government versus opposition, etc. Yes.
I think if they have the same level of knowledge, they can be in a higher level of knowledge, they can be, let's say, pretty convinced of their position. And there could be a problem of polarization.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not very, let's say, that's not good for democracy.
Right.
There's not, let's say, space for compromise.
Okay, okay. Well, that brings us on very nicely to the next one. Choice and competition. There has to be some kind of political competition, and there has to be some kind of choice. The voters need to be offered meaningful choices, right? Now you're quite right. This is a dilemma. This is a predicament. One more predicament. It may well be that you need quite a high level of compromise to make many political systems work, but at the same time, you need to be able to give voters choices, and you need to have a system of political competition. If politicians are spending the whole time building compromise with one another, does that undermine political competition? Does that undermine political choice? You know this one. This is a famous debate. We hear it every day. Yes?
Does arguably then having so many tiers of government kind of compromise democracy in the sense of you get down to like city level
Yeah.
or like district level voting within cities? A lot of times you have one person running for a seat.
Yes.
Because it's a relatively small position, but they're using that as their foot in the door.
Mm.
Then the voter doesn't have a choice. You can either vote for that person or not vote, but either way, that's the person who's getting the job.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think sort of multi-level governance actually cuts both ways. It can be a problem. It can be a good thing. It can be a good thing in that it obviously spreads power out and avoids domination, right? It's closer to the citizens, gives people choices at different levels, right? So, if the choice is a bit limited at one level, it's perhaps a bit more meaningful at another level. But again, there are going to be huge problems with that. I mean, we're going to talk a bit about externalities later, that, the more power devolved to smaller political units, then perhaps they will not always take into account the negative and positive externalities involved in their decisions that follow from their decisions. But we'll come on to that. Finally, identity and political community. People need to be able to accept decisions as made by a majority, a collectivity that they think has a right to make binding decisions on them. It's no good having a perfect democracy that people feel they're not a part of. You could imagine a procedurally perfect democracy. Complete public control, 100% political equality. You could imagine a procedurally perfect democracy, but if people say, well, look, I'm not part of that system, they will feel that they are dominated and not a part of it, right? So you need identity and democratic political community as well. Have I included everything?
Actually, I think in terms of the knowledge, so I don't think that somebody needs new information or knowledge per se, but it's a basic condition to have a tenant to reach that knowledge in whatever the conditions are in front of you. That is critical thinking, because as democracies in decline in several areas of the world today, so the reason, propaganda is not trying to lie people. It's not just trying to make the reality blurred. And so the ones who want to react don't react anymore. That's the main purpose behind. So the encouragement of critical thinking. So whatever information you face, being able to connect the dots. I think that's the basic kind of that every population needs.
I mean, I think that it gets really problematic if you try to define critical thinking as a requirement for democracy, because then you could say, well, people who have a disability shouldn't be able to vote.
Right.
Say that that's not equal. Yeah. I think that you can argue for having some degree of an education system, of education that's readily available.
But you cannot require that only people who are educated should vote, as John Stuart Mill argued.
What Finland is doing is a great example of what was meaning to say. It's a country which has totally transformed the education system into encouraging solely the quality of critical thinking and
the method of it.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what leads to a perfect condition of knowledge-making tools.
Okay. Now, I'm mentioning all of this obviously because I think it's relevant to how we think about differentiated integration and democracy. So let's now move on. Just first look at some basic understandings of EU democracy. This is hugely obvious. This is almost banal, but it's very, very important for us to start with it. Two free different understandings of European Union democracy. Two free different understandings of how to deliver public control with political equality and justification at the European Union level. One is the idea that the European Union itself should be a democracy. The European Union should itself be a democracy. It should have democratic institutions and a democratic politics of its own. So there should be choice and political competition over European Union questions at the European Union level. So you, as citizens of the European Union, should have periodic opportunities to vote in elections that decide the composition of the European Union institutions, and you should have an equal opportunity with all other EU citizens. And you should be offered a meaningful choice. You should be offered a meaningful choice over how the European Union should exercise its powers over, say, the next 5-year period. The European Union should itself be a democracy. Okay, tell me, how close are we to that? How close are we to that?
Depends on who you ask.
Right. Yes, please.
I would say not very much, because a lot of those elements are still like not implemented. So the member states still have a lot of control. If you look at the institution as well, like the European Council, Council of the European Union or European Council, both, and also if you look at the Parliament, so for example, not each vote of each citizen in the EU counts equally for seats in Parliament.
Why don't votes count equally? What do you mean when you say votes don't count equally?
So, for example, the number of people represented by one member of parliament is different. So, for example, the relation when somebody's like a citizen of Malta or something like that.
Okay.
Lower than, for example, a citizen of Germany.
All right. All right. But yes, please.
I don't agree very much with the point that the EU should be a democracy itself. I mean, the EU was built like to maintain democracy in member states.
That's the next one. That we will talk about in a moment.
And that's the way in which basically the EU has been built. As today we are seeing, let's say, development towards supranationalism, but it still maintains, let's say, an intergovernmental character. And that's why basically the European Parliament today doesn't have, let's say, and it is not connected to representation, in my opinion, but it's much more connected to member states. It's totally connected with member states. And the Council of the Europe, that is one thing you can say, the members of the Council of Europe are elected by national citizens from member states. I mean, at least most of them.
Right.
In Italy, we don't basically, in Italian, we don't elect, let's say, ministers. But they represent member states.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay. Yes, please.
I wonder to what extent the right to justification that we were talking about, the minimum components is there because there's space for EU rules that are progressively enforced and EU citizens to be explained or justified. Or
Right. Okay. Okay. So what might be the problem in delivering that at the European level? Why isn't it there?
maybe there's no EU public sphere.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's the crucial one, isn't it? There's no EU public sphere. There may be lots of national political public spheres, but it's more questionable whether there's such a thing as a European Union public sphere. But look, okay, well, what if I said, but they're European elections? Every 5 years, every citizen of the European Union has a right to vote in European elections. There's no other international body, there's no other political body that exercises power beyond the state, where there are direct elections, where you, the European Union citizens, can vote directly for people, for representatives, people to represent you in the European Parliament. So here we have a political system that's mainly about rule-making, it's mainly about law-making. And what's the procedure for making law? You need co-decision of the Council. and of the European Parliament, and we, the happy citizens of the European Union, get to elect these people in the European Parliament. Therefore, ergo, we have a democracy at the European Union level. Now, what's the problem with that argument?
There's the obvious argument that the Parliament can't introduce laws.
Right, it can usually only respond, but amending proposals is a form of agenda setting.
There is something that they're hearing from their voters that is the most pressing issue to
Yeah.
them, and it doesn't come up in the other institutions.
Mm-hmm.
They can't bring that to the table
Okay.
themselves and say,
Okay,
here's the
so,
thing that we need to do.
okay.
And then also you start running questions of voter turnout rates. Like if
Yep,
you have an election
okay.
that say,
So what was-
20% of people voted, is that a democratic representation?
So it's 50%, isn't it? In the last European elections, turnout was about 50%, and it was very low in some member states. It goes down to about 20% in countries like Slovakia. Yes, please.
I think there's also the issue about who elects the president of the commission, because the elections of the European Parliament don't necessarily.
Right. Okay, so we would really want a political system in which the public is able to control all decisions. And that may not be enough just to elect the European Parliament, firstly because the European Parliament has limited powers of initiative, even though it has powers of co-decision over the ultimate decision. But a further problem is that the Parliament has limited powers over the appointment of the Commission, which is the executive body. Right, so it's perhaps a bit difficult to argue that there is a complete system of public control. Remember, public control is the very first part of my definition. It's pretty difficult perhaps to argue that there is a complete system of public control delivered through European elections, delivered through the right of each EU citizens to vote in European elections. But I think there's a further problem with European elections that we haven't, I don't think, quite mentioned yet. Yes, please.
There are different, let's say, systems, electoral systems.
Different electoral systems, yes.
Basically, it takes time in different days also.
Yeah.
And also the, let's say, constituencies may vary across countries.
Yeah.
There is not very homogeneous.
Which could all be problems of political equality, which goes back to the point which was made over there about how people from different EU countries have kind of different weights, right? Their votes count for more or less. Yeah.
It also seems like, especially compared to national politics, that knowledge component we talked on earlier is lacking.
Right, okay.
Like just in how the EU functions and what they're voting for, what it actually means.
Right. Right. I'm sure there's lots of empirical evidence on this. I mean, there are all these questions which people are asked the whole time about, there are 29 member states of the European Union, true or false, right? There are all the various tests of how much knowledge people have, but probably the answer is they have less knowledge about the European Union than the national systems. But nobody has mentioned the term I'm really trying to get at. The big problem with European elections. We see it in the literature. It's been for 40 years. The literature has just gone on and on and on about this problem of European elections. What is it? Mm-hmm. It's turnout, but more broadly than that. Democratic deficits, but I mean, it's second-order European elections. Has anyone? Yeah, you've come across it in the literature. Second-order character of European elections. Okay, there's an elected parliament that has some powers at the European level, but European elections are not really about the European Union. That's what the second-order theory says. European elections are about national politics. They're dominated by national politics. They're not really about the European Union. So we have a kind of Alice in Wonderland political system, a crazy political system in which European elections are not about the body that is in fact being elected. They're not about the body that is in fact being elected. Now, that short-circuits public control. How can you have a system in which representatives are brought to account for what they've been doing over the last 5 years, or made to account for how they should do things over the next 5 years, if elections are not even about the political system in which they're going to be exercising their powers, right? So it seems that we have huge problems constructing a democracy at European level. We have had a system of direct elections for 40 years, but still a lot of voting seems to be linked to domestic politics rather than European politics. There doesn't seem to be a system of political competition that is structured around choices relevant to the exercise of the European Union's own powers, So many of the different conditions which we talked about earlier seem to be coming into play here. We haven't got a system of public control. We haven't got a system of political competition in which voters are offered choices about how to use the European Union's powers over the next 5 years. We seem to have a limited public sphere. Now, there is, of course, a lot of debate about how far European elections are still second order. There's some people who think things are changing a bit, that they're becoming less second order. But I think you can still see that there have been big, big problems trying to construct a full system of democratic politics at the European level. I don't think we need to resolve the debate about how far European elections are still second order in order to say, in the past, they have been largely dominated by domestic politics, and this shows us how very, very difficult it is to construct democratic politics at the European level. And this is going to be important when we go on to differentiated integration in a few minutes. But of course, we next need to look at the other ways in which the European Union could be made democratic. We said it could itself be a democracy. It could have its own democratic institutions and its own democratic politics. But the obvious alternative to all of that is the European Union should be democratically controlled through its member state democracies, through its component democracies, the 27 national democracies. Why not just control the European Union through its 27 member state democracies? What do you think? If it's so difficult to construct a democracy at the European level, what's the problem with just controlling the European Union through its component member state democracies? Yes, please.
It's not necessarily efficient because I guess then every member state would have the right of the veto right.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Right.
we already have like a council and
Right.
it's
Okay. Okay, so there'd be lots of veto points. So maybe the public wants certain outcomes at the European Union level. That would be incompatible. The public itself wants certain outcomes at the European Union level. That would be incompatible with 27 veto points, which would be required for each member state democracy to remain in control. Somebody, yes, please.
I think there has to be like an external body overseeing everything just to
Mm-hmm.
make things fair, because I think some people could end up having more power than others than if that's the case.
Mm-hmm. So is this a problem of externalities again? So if you have control by each national democracy, it will only be considering its own point of view and not considering the external effects for the other democracies? Yes, please.
You know, like a similar problem to the second all elections, because then again, people, when like the member states control like the important issues in the EU, the member states or the governments from the member states themselves are elected again on like domestic issues and not at EU level.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like about EU issues again.
Right. The whole idea of a European Union is to solve problems together. So why fragment it into 27 different democratic processes and debates? Finally, I just mentioned on this slide, there are obvious combinations of the two. So, we've said European Union could itself be a democracy. It could be controlled by its member states. There are obvious ways of combining those two things. Compound democracy. Sergio Fabrini. You often hear people talking about the European Union as a compound democracy. So that there are possibilities of delivering public control at both levels, or through the two different levels. And maybe even that's the only possible solution. That it will be very, very difficult to solve certain kind of collective action problems without some level of democracy at the European Union level, without some level of decision-making at the European level that then needs to be held to account to the European voters as a whole. It's difficult to construct a full system of democratic politics at the Union level, so you might well expect some kind of control by the component national democracies. And even then when national democracies are committing themselves to membership of the European Union, they have exit options, so they can kind of periodically withdraw. And this could even be something that we can think about with differentiated integration. So a compound democracy is obviously some kind of a way of dealing with the different problems. Right, at last we can get on to differentiated integration. Implications for DI, or implications of DI, depend on which model of EU democracy is preferred. DI fits better, differentiated integration fits better with the idea of a European Union that is democratically controlled and legitimated by its member states. DI fits better with the idea of the European Union controlled and legitimated by its individual national democracies. DI, from that point of view, from the point of view of a European Union of national democracies, DI is just a form of live and let live. It helps accommodate the preferences of different national democracies. It allows some national democracies to decide in one way, other national democracies to decide in another way. It allows some national democracies to choose more integration without being constrained and dominated by the others, without being stopped from doing that by the others. And it allows another set of national democracies to choose not to integrate. So from the point of view of controlling the European Union through its component national democracies, DI, differentiated integration, arguably just produces a better alignment between the preferences of national democracies and the collective decisions of the European Union. There are problems with that argument, of course, but you can see broadly that DI fits better, fits more easily with the idea that the European Union should be controlled through its component national democracies. As I go on to say, DI can facilitate compromise between national democracies. It can better accommodate different preferences over different levels of integration. This is especially important in the case of sovereignty DI. Frank, of course, has written hugely about sovereignty DI. I'm sure he's been telling you about it. Cases where a particular member state doesn't want to take part in further integration for reasons of identity. Cases where a particular member state sees an institution or a policy at the European Union level as removing its sovereignty, as difficult to reconcile with its own sovereignty as a democracy. Much easier to accommodate member states that have a real problem from the point of view of sovereignty or identity if there is DI than if there is uniform decision-making. That's obvious. DI can also operate as an alternative to majority voting. Again, you may well have discussed this. There's a huge amount of research that shows that the Council of Ministers almost never votes. That's an exaggeration. There's a huge amount of research that shows how relatively rare it is for the Council of Ministers to vote at all. It's only about in 10 or 15% of cases, isn't it, that the Council of Ministers votes. And even where it does vote, it's usually just one or two member states who are voting against. Now, I think this is almost the single most important fact about the European Union, that the Council of Ministers almost never votes, even when qualified majority voting is possible. The Council of Ministers almost always strives to get complete agreement of all member states. Why do you think it does that?
Well, I was thinking to the Luxembourg compromises. So
Yeah.
historical precedents that require, when it's possible, always to reach unanimity in order to satisfy everyone.
Yes, to satisfy everyone. Any other reasons why the European Union does that? Why the Council does that? Even when qualified majority voting is possible, it's pretty rare, right? The Council tries to decide by complete agreement, a consensus of the member states, yes.
Yeah, there's voting vetoing decision may entail some political cost to those countries who do it. They don't really want to be the one left out from the decision.
Okay, they don't want to be left out. Who implements European Union decisions?
Yeah, the member governments.
Member governments.
For example, if many member governments were just enough,
Yeah.
it would still pass through qualified majority, but some of them wouldn't implement it.
That's it, that's the problem.
That would lead to long processes.
That's the problem, isn't it? So member states implement decisions. If member governments are outvoted in the Council of Ministers, maybe they're not going to implement very well, or they're going to take a long time to implement. It's better to build compromise and consensus in the first place, to try to get the complete agreement of the member states. And as I say, I think this is almost the single most important, but largely unobserved fact about the European Union. I mean, how many people, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but how many people in the Brexit debate knew that the UK had almost never been outvoted in the Council of Ministers? How many people in the Brexit debate knew that the UK is only outvoted 2 or 3% of the time in the Council of Ministers? Almost no one. It was almost never mentioned, but it's hugely important. It means that most member state democracies approve most European Union decisions. Now, DI can help here. DI can help here. It's a further way in which the Council can get the complete agreement of all member states to all decisions. It could be that only 1 or 2 member states that have a difficulty with the decision, give them a derogation, give them an opt-out, and then all 27 can move on happily, they can all agree together, right? So DI is part of this, is an essential part of this process, to my mind. I mean, Frank will probably tell me I've got it completely wrong, but anyway, DI to my mind is an essential part of the process by which almost all European Union decisions are aligned with the preferences of almost all European Union governments most of the time. There are some obvious exceptions, but most of the time I think this is the pattern. So, DI may be a part of the process by which the Union can act collectively, whilst individual member governments remain individually responsible to national parliaments and electorates. If most governments agree most European Union decisions, and if derogations and DI is part of the process that enables each government to agree almost all European Union decisions, there is no reason why each national government should not be more accountable than it is right now to its own national parliament and its own national voters. Right? So, here I think are a whole series of factors whereby DI fits quite nicely with the idea of a European Union controlled democratically by its component member states. Any questions? Anyone want to fight? Anyone want to fight? Any questions? Anyone disagree? Yes, please.
What you said about decision-making in council is extremely interesting. But what does that say about recent discussions on getting rid of unanimity? I mean, if the council is not even using the quality.
Right. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Why is unanimity so important, even though it's almost never used? Not only are people saying get rid of it entirely, but almost everything, since the Single European Act has been moving in the direction of greater majority voting, yet it is almost never used. I think it remains important, even though the Council strives at its very hardest to reach complete agreement of all of the member states. I think it's useful to have the ultimate power to go to majority voting if you have a completely unreasonable member state government. And I won't mention any. I am a citizen of one of them, or used to be, one of the most unreasonable ones. but there are others.
I have also some question about democratic implications of differentiated integration. Is pretty clear to me when we talk about internal differentiated integration.
Mm-hmm.
But what about democratic implications of external differentiation?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's where I'm going to finish. So I won't give anything away, but I'm going to finish with that one. Okay. So I just... Yeah, okay. No, that is right. That is right. DI is more difficult to reconcile with the other model of European Union democracy. So it fits nicely, according to me. On the whole, it fits nicely with the idea of the European Union being democratically controlled through its member state democracies, but DI is more difficult to reconcile with the idea that the European Union should construct its own democratic institutions with its own system of democratic politics. It might constrain the development of a shared identity, shared sense of democratic political community. Remember that list of conditions which we started off with. We said that identity and shared democratic community is important there. So if you've got a kind of crazy patchwork, of different policies, some countries are opted into these and some are opted out of those, then maybe that's going to make it a bit harder to construct some kind of shared sense of identity and democratic community at the European Union level. I'm going to take a big risk here. One of my favorite ideas about political identity is that you need a system in which people see themselves as part of a Schicksalgemeinschaft. Is that right, the right term? A Schicksalgemeinschaft, a community of fate. A community of fate. We are in this together. We are in this together. We will either swim together or we will sink together. It's a community of fate, right? I mean, maybe that's an important element in constructing an identity. We just have to get on with it and cooperate because we are part of a community of fate. We will swim together or we will sink together. Now, if you have a kind of crazy patchwork of differentiated integration, if each time we encounter a problem, we just kind of cop out and say, oh, we'll just give those countries opt-outs and all of the rest of it, will you really construct a European Union that is a community of fate, where people feel they're all part of some kind of a political association that is there to solve their problems in common? That could be a difficulty. What do you think? Do you think differentiated integration is an obstacle to the formation of identity, public sphere, political competition, all of these other things at the European level? Or am I exaggerating? Yes.
I mean, it could be. But what about like creating different countries in the tier of differentiated integration? Just like
Right.
Just like following the French proposal,
Mm-hmm.
the Schengen Council.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know it's maybe exaggerated now, but
Right.
what about that?
I think there would be at least two problems. One is the poor old voter. You're making the voter work too hard. And I don't want to go down the road of, I don't want to go down the road of, most voters are idiots and they function with a much lower rationality in public choices than when making decisions about their own private lives. Please don't mistake me. Please don't think that I'm insulting the voter, but maybe there are limits to how far voters are prepared to participate in the political process continuously. Maybe one of the big arguments for representation is simply that voters can get on with the rest of their lives and leave a lot of political decisions to those who represent them. I'll park that one and move on to what is perhaps the second difficulty. I think it would be externalities again. So if you have a hugely complex political structure in which you've got a system of representation for each form of differentiation, will each of those decision-making units, will each of those democracies, if you like, consider the full external effects of each of their decisions? That, I think, could be a problem as well. Anyone else on this one? Yes?
I mean, on the issue of a community of fate, arguably the EU only exists because states already shared that.
Yeah.
They were aware that if one of them went down, all of Europe was falling. Essentially, like there was going to be a major issue, another World War II.
Remember what, but also on even rather more banal things. Remember what Merkel said during the financial crisis. If the euro collapses, then so does the European Union.
And that's been the case since the coal and steel community.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I would just still say that different integration could be beneficial because then the countries only commit to those things they are really invested in, and of course also then like the citizens, and in general I guess that's more positive of just being a part of the things you're really committed to.
Yeah, okay.
And then maybe having to also cooperate on like things you don't really agree about.
Yeah.
So it could
Yeah.
just in general
Yeah.
make
Okay.
a more positive like view or generate a more positive view of the EU in general.
Yeah, so that's fair enough.
I think there's concerns for DI maybe weakening this potential solidarity that can develop between the citizens of member states, right? So if they don't all participate to the area of maybe justice and home affairs, but there's issues that are actually transnational. So a country being out maybe means that it's seen as like not pulling its weight or not contributing as much. I think it can lead to debates of this.
Okay.
Are you equally?
Okay, yep.
I mean, I guess the form of integration would have to be really inclusive and open for member states to join quickly and decide, this seems to be a good idea and we want to also like open the train and increase cooperation on this issue, that it's easy for them to join if they're going to do so.
Okay. Yeah. All very good. I go on to point out it's not just that it might obstruct the kind of construction of a shared identity, it might also constrain the development of a single system of democratic political competition. You know, if particular member states are opted out of particular policies, it's going to be more difficult, isn't it? For instance, for pan-European parties, or at least federations of national parties, to get together at the European Union level, agree some kind of a political program, and then offer it to the voters, right, in all 27 member states. So maybe differentiated integration might also obstruct the emergence, the development of a single system of democratic political competition at the European Union level. So a lot of the political fights might then be about, you know, whether our member state needs an opt-out from X, Y, or Z, rather than whether we should be doing X, Y, Z at all, right? Okay. DI might also produce forms of incongruence. This is often argued. This is something you often come across. It might produce forms of incongruence. In other words, there is not a match. Incongruence is where there is not a match between the representatives who are taking decisions and the voters who are affected by the decisions of the representatives. So, I mean, it's a very easy thing to think about if you just think about sort of concrete examples. 20 members of the European Eurozone, soon to be 20 members of the Eurozone, 27 member states. Should representatives from the 7 or 8 members who are not part of the Eurozone be able to participate in Eurozone decisions? They may one day find themselves adopting the single currency, so perhaps they are affected and they should be included. But then, their citizens are not going to be as affected as those who are full members of the European Union, so why should they have the same weight in the decision as the people who are members of the Eurozone? Yes?
Doesn't that also, though, arguably happen at the national level?
Yeah, it is a pervasive problem of politics.
Decisions
Yeah.
about waterways, and one area of the country doesn't have rivers.
Yes, indeed. I mean, but we have in the UK, we know this is the Midlothian problem. It goes all the way back to the 1970s when devolution was first proposed for Scotland. So if there's devolution for Scotland, does this mean that the Scottish MPs should not be allowed to vote in the House of Commons on questions that do not affect Scotland, right? So, this problem of incongruence is a pretty common problem of many political systems. But you can see how it would pan out in the case of the European Union. I'm going to give you a few examples of this. The European Council that appointed the first European Central Bank. This is 1998. Who was in the presidency of the Council? The United Kingdom, Tony Blair. So this is a decision that isn't affecting the United Kingdom. Well, I shouldn't say isn't affecting. UK much less affected by the other member states, but the member state in the chair was the United Kingdom. So, and then the European Parliament, okay? What do you think? Do you think that MEPs should be excluded if they come from a country that has an opt-out? Do you think they should be excluded from the decision, from the policy? Should they be included or excluded? What do you think? Yes?
I don't think they should be excluded. The European Parliament is not an intergovernmental body.
I didn't hear that, sorry.
The European Parliament is not an intergovernmental body. They are not representing their member states, but they're European citizens in general, even though they...
Okay, so the European Parliament is said to represent all citizens of the Union, even though they're elected in particular member states. They have a duty to reflect on the implications of what is being proposed for all citizens of the European Union and to vote accordingly. That is a strong argument that is often made, that the European Parliament is the representation of the European Union as a whole and not of particular member states. Therefore, MEPs from countries that are opted out of particular policies should be included in the deliberation and votes of the European Parliament. Anyone disagree? Yes, please.
I just think that in the Parliament, from what I understand, members of Parliament, like in the European Parliament, really vote according to their national preferences rather than thinking of everyone else. I know with French MEPs, they're thinking of French national interests, and when they talk about French problems, and they don't really care about what happens in Latvia or I don't know.
Okay. And what about the? And what about the dear German Constitutional Court? In its ruling, in its ruling on the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, the German Constitutional Court said in all seriousness, the European Parliament is a representation of the component member democracies of the European Union. MEPs are elected in their member states. And that's how it should be, even in the case of the European Parliament. So you can see that there's bound to be huge disagreement on this question of congruence, right? Should representatives of member states that are opted out be included in all decisions? I don't think we can resolve this. Unless anyone is prepared to have a go, I don't think it's resolvable. It kind of just depends on your starting point. Do you think the European Parliament is a representation of the European Union as a whole, or do you think it's a representation of the member democracies? It all depends on where you are on that one. Further problem is that differentiated integration may be path dependent. It may grow over time. So countries that opt in to particular policies become even more integrated over time in those particular policies. Further decisions have to be made, further problems have to be addressed so they integrate further. And those who don't take part are further away from those who are opted in, right? Differentiated integration may be kind of path-dependent and self-reinforcing, self-confirming. So once you allow it, maybe there's no way back to a kind of integrated democratic politics in which the same policies apply everywhere, and there's an integrated form of political competition. There is a kind of shared identity, community of fate, and all of the rest of it. What do you think? Do you think you must have been discussing this over the last 4 days. Do you think differentiated integration kind of becomes more pronounced over time?
We just saw with Denmark that it can change.
Indeed, that's an interesting counterexample. You can kind of hop from one to the other. But yes.
But concerning the case with Denmark, I guess it would be more like easier to opt in than opt out in a way. So the question would be whether, if, like in a later stage, and like one sector of politics is really deeply integrated, and whether it's at all possible. But it can have like the euro. So I don't know. Leave the euro at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it really does depend, doesn't it? I mean, it may be that it's quite easy to opt in, even 20 or 30 years later, because the decisions have not been made in a way that you find particularly difficult. Conversely, though, it can be that if you're not represented over a process of 20 or 30 years, and you are then constrained to join some kind of form of differentiated integration. I mean, this again is a bit like the UK case, except it was, you know, membership as a whole rather than differentiated integration. In the UK, as you well know, did not take part in 1950 and then 1957, and then a whole load of European Union policies developed in a way that were very, very difficult for the UK to accept, right? Sure, that's a problem of, you know, that's an example from UI, from uniform integration, but you can still see how it might happen with differentiated integration too. Okay. Yes, please.
I mean, differentiated integration may lead to uniformity. We see it like, for instance, in the economic and monetary union. Like with the entrance, for instance, the banking union of many countries, the banking union may be, let's say, a transitory period towards the economic and monetary union. So basically, yeah, DiCE basically can lead to uniformity. So
okay.
it's not like a permanent.
Right. Yeah, yes, one more.
I would also assume that kind of like public tendency occurred at almost like every decision made in politics, because like, for example, if one member states disagree on integrating one sector of politics, and then they try to solve the issue like on a national level, then that also leads to half and three decisions being made and hard to like return. And so in the end, I would say it's of course happening by public tendencies, but I wouldn't really say there's an argument against it, because I mean they are always occurring.
Yeah, they may well be pretty pervasive, but I mean, it might conceivably argue, though, for the European Union having some kind of set of norms which allow latecomers to catch up, that limit the chances of them being completely excluded and so on and so forth. I mean, these norms that are kind of attached to flexible, enhanced cooperation, aren't there? Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this idea that there's an open door principle to know countries of them, but they didn't get enhanced cooperation, they get to sit at the
Right, yeah, they at least have voice even if they don't have a vote.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
okay.
a way to bridge this potential for the ins to go too far. That would make the outs never want to join.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I think DI also has different implications depending on whether we're talking about internal DI or external DI. If it's internal DI, a member state that doesn't want to take part is still part of the union. That member state has a veto over future treaty changes, which can be linked to, you know, how it's treated by the ins, those who've gone forward on their own. Remember also that the European Union is above all a process that requires the day-to-day cooperation of each member state. It's a bit like what we were talking about earlier with voting in the Council. The whole system depends on the day-to-day cooperation of each member state. So it's not just that each member state has a veto over future treaty changes. It's also all the other member states have to try their hardest to secure the day-to-day cooperation of each member state if the system is to work at all. So if a country has opted out, or in effect being excluded because the others require conditions that are very difficult for it to meet, it does have the protection the safeguard that all of the other member states have to try to maintain cooperation with that country, with that member state. So I think it's much easier to reconcile DI with the democratic control of particular member states in cases of internal DI. It's hugely, hugely harder to deal with cases of external differentiation. Poor countries like Switzerland and Norway that have very strong reasons for not being members of the European Union. They've tried to be members of the European Union, and they're publics, or at least in the case of Norway, they've tried to be members of the European Union. In the case of Switzerland, they tried to be a member of the EEA, and their publics voted against. It's this sovereignty DI, the problems of identity and how different different democracies feel about giving away powers to supranational bodies. So there may be countries that find it very difficult to participate in the European Union, and yet, in some way or another, they need to solve collective action problems with the European Union. They're in an impossible position. They can neither join, nor can they be fully outside, nor can they have nothing to do with the European Union. They still have to work with it and cooperate with it to solve key collective action problems. There are also problems in both cases, whether it's internal DI or external DI. Ins can impose negative externalities on outs, and outs can free ride on what the ins are doing to solve collective action problems. Ins can impose harms on outs, and outs can free ride on the provision of essential public goods, international public goods, by the European Union. Democratic institutions at the national level might even make some of these problems worse. National parliaments, national electorates may have little incentive to take negative externalities into account. We could imagine a world in which all voters and all people who are competing for power are completely self-interested. Zero altruism, zero altruism. All they think about is how to optimize their own preferences. If democracies can impose harms on others, or if they can free ride on the provision of goods by others, then the national parliaments and the national voters are going to have the same interest, right? So a national parliament isn't going to control a government from imposing negative externalities on outs if voters, in particular member democracies, simply reward that as a kind of political behavior. But I do want to come back at the very end now to the whole problem of democracy and external DI. So the argument that things are just a whole lot harder where you've got non-member states that need in some way to cooperate with the European Union, need in some way to perhaps participate in European Union policies. Here's a puzzle. It's a really complicated puzzle. But I'm going to ask you this, just as a way of finishing. Can anyone solve the puzzle? As I say, there are 6 parts to the puzzle. Each of those points is one part of the puzzle. First one, non-member states find it hard not to be a part of the EU's single market. And I'm really focusing on the single market. Non-member states find it really hard not to be a part of the EU's single market. And I will bet you any money you like the United Kingdom is going to have this problem. Right? Non-member states find it really hard not to be a part of the EU single market. Second part of the puzzle. Being a part of the EU single market requires non-members to adopt a huge amount of European Union law. What is a single market if it is not a huge enterprise in shared lawmaking? Remember what single markets do. They remove so-called behind-border obstacles to trade. They require similar laws. The European Union, by some calculations, makes about 20 or 30% of law in most member states. Around 20, 30% of law in most member states. Forget all of this stuff that says it makes 80% of law. That's a misquotation from Jacques Delors. The reality is the EU makes about 20 or 30% of law in force in most member states. And most of that law, I think, is single market law. To have a single market, you just have to have a whole load of shared rules. Third problem. Dynamic or real-time convergence of laws between members and non-members is needed to create a real single market. So, you need a whole lot of laws to create a single market, and those laws have to be aligned with one another in real time. If there are huge gaps, if it takes 3-4 years to bring a national set of laws into line with European Union laws, you will not get real-time alignment. You won't really have a single market. You have to have a real single market. You don't just need shared rules, shared laws. You need to make sure that the shared rules and shared laws are convergent over time, right? Dynamic and fourth problem. Any dynamic convergence, any convergence of laws over time has to be on EU laws rather than on non-member laws. It's the European Union single market these non-members want access to. So, of course, the convergence has to be on EU laws, not on, for instance, Norwegian laws. You won't get the European Union converging on Norwegian laws. It's the other way around. It's Norwegian laws that have to converge on European Union law to make a single market work, or to bring a non-member into a single market. Fifth problem. The EU is limited in the decision rights that it can give to non-members. How can there be a distinction between non-members and members if non-members can have exactly the same decision rights as members? No cherry picking. Sixth problem. Both EU citizens and those of non-member democracies need to be able to control all of their laws as equals. We started off by saying that. We started off by saying that's the definition of democracy, that citizens need to be able to control all of their laws as equals. So here we have this system. Non-member states need to be involved in the EU single market. To do that, they have to adopt a whole lot of EU law. The EU cannot give non-member states decision rights in its own decision-making. EU citizens, believe it or not, have a right to control their own laws as equals without having a whole lot of outsiders imposed upon them. On the other hand, these outside countries, these outside democracies like Switzerland and Norway, also consists of citizens who need to be able to, who ought to be able to control their own laws as equals. Okay, I can't solve this puzzle. I wonder if anyone here can.